Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the critique of open theism, What is at Stake? The Trustworthiness of God by Paul Kjoss Helseth. Now, this is going to be a fascinating and interesting discussion tonight, and the reason is actually for something that I was not aware of. And what I wasn't aware of is that Gregory Boyd has actually changed his position. Now, he did so actually many years ago. That's the funny thing about reading different books and articles and stuff like that, is sometimes you can get very out of date on things. But he wrote a book, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. And I was pretty shocked by some of the things that were in this book and some of the quotes that can be stated from this book of Gregory Boyd's, because he, in all honesty, denies central tenets of open theism. And that's his answer, his way to actually address the various critiques that come in. And so we're going to take a look at this because I was genuinely shocked. I was shocked by the types of admissions he was making. I was shocked by the types of statements he was making, the conclusions he was being drawn. Like, it kind of hit me on the blind side. I was really surprised to see how he had changed his views over time. Excuse me. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into this. But this is going to be a bit of a different one because in some sense, we're not even really dealing with open theism per se, but we're dealing with Boyd's capitulations and how they actually aren't even open theism anymore. So anyway, you'll see as we begin to dive in here. So let's go ahead and just start out by again reiterating the central claim of Orthodox theologians. That claim being that, quote, God is an omniscient being who has exhaustive knowledge of the whole scope of cosmic history. In other words, why does God have exhaustive knowledge? How does he know everything? What is his omniscience? The classical argument would be that he knows all true propositions about everything in the past, present, and future. And he does so that literally gets down to even the minor things. Okay? The problem that this necessarily raises, or at least that's very easy to see in some sense, and the problem that open theism attempts to deal with is, but then how do we reconcile divine omniscience and creaturely freedom? Okay? And so typically, the question then gets into this sort of thing. There is a tension there, right? There's a tension there between God's omniscient knowledge of everything and ultimately it being part of his divine decree versus creaturely freedom. How do people make real free choices? And then you have the compounding problem of the problem of evil. How does that not make God essentially the primary cause of all evil, right? These are some of the big questions that theologians deal with. These are some of the big questions that open theism tries to answer. Now, the explanation would be is that there's some way of thinking of omniscience that doesn't undermine the authenticity of human angelic freedom and doesn't compromise the scope of sovereign knowledge. Okay? And so what then is the thesis? So the thesis of this chapter, as purported by Helseth, is this, quote, despite the creative, yet remarkably conventional nature of Boyd's recent attempts to render the open view of evil plausible, the view remains deeply flawed, not only because it is essentially incoherent, but because, more importantly, it undermines the believer's confidence in precisely that which it purports to champion, namely the love of God for his creatures, end quote. And so it's interesting, when I first read that thesis of his chapter, I was like, wow, that's fascinating. I wonder what Boyd's change is. Like how are we getting to there? With like deeply flawed, with countering the very love that open theism tends to report. And as I read on and read more of Boyd's quotes and looked into it, I was like, oh my goodness, it really does. So we're going to kind of hit on this because this was a fascinating turn of events here. So first, let's talk about the omniscience of God, creaturely freedom, and the problem of evil. And we'll talk about it from the openness perspective. So we're going to go through generally an understanding of open theism at this point. So last time we were on here, I talked about how I thought to myself, open theism is making a redefinition of something. It's either redefining omniscience, or it's redefining knowledge, or it's redefining what can constitute knowledge. Like, there's something that's being changed here, okay? And the comment is whatever's being changed was removing future realities as being things that could be known. In other words, future realities are things that can no longer be known under open theism. And so essentially, open theism typically states something like this, that there's a tension between omniscience and freedom, and the only way to redefine that is to redefine in some sense, again, however you want to split hairs and look at it, either the nature of omniscience or the nature of knowable things. One of the two. And you're sort of essentially changing one definition by changing the other because they're sort of defined in conjunction with each other. And the argument is simply that there are some things that God simply cannot know. Okay, that's the general claim here. There's some things that God simply can't know. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of Boyd's comments on page 277 here. Boyd argues, quote, "To assume he knows ahead of time how every person is going to freely act assumes that each person's free activity is already there to know, even before he freely does it. But it's not. If we have been given freedom, we create the reality of our decisions by making them. And until we make them, they don't exist. Thus, in my view at least, there simply isn't anything to know until we make it there to know. So God can't foreknow the good or bad decisions of the people he creates until he creates these people, and they in turn create their decisions." Now, there's actually a lot of interesting things about Boyd's statement here that I kind of want to just dive into, and I don't necessarily have all the answers ready at hand. These are things that I would like to, that seem fishy to me in the sense that I think I would not refer to things as Boyd is referring to them. And I think this probably has to do with how Boyd understands time versus how I would understand time. But one of those is this. When he makes a comment like this. First of all, freedom. So they have a different definition of freedom than I would have. So that's one issue right there. He would have a different definition. Then he talks about creating the reality of our decisions by making them, and until we make them, they don't exist. Well, again, we now have to get into what does existence mean in terms of a future reality? Because the argument here would be sort of that only the present really exists. But not only that, that ideas about the future either are ideas about non-real things. Like there's some interesting philosophical questions you'd have to ask here. What is an idea about a non-real abstract thing versus, for example, God's knowledge, if God does have knowledge, which I would argue does, about things that will happen, quote, in the future, but God has that knowledge from eternity. So how does the knowledge of eternity, or from an eternal perspective, relate to the reality of a temporal event? That's a legitimate question that, I'll say it like this, at least from this quote there, and I'm sure he's got an answer to this. So I'm not saying he doesn't have an answer, so I'm not saying they don't have it, but the way that he's talking about this, I think I would have some issues or disagreements even in the very arguments being posed. Because what he's posing here is sort of a logical flow, like, well, this is true, then this can't be true, and this is true, then this can't be true. But I'm sort of disagreeing with a number of assumptions that he has built in here, and so I would say I'm not swayed by that argument, because I don't think we agree on time, I don't think we agree on existence, I don't think we agree on even the definition of freedom. So God can't, and again he says, so God can't foreknow the good or bad decisions until he creates people, and they in turn create their decisions. And again, create people and then sort of create decisions. I would argue that there's a bit of an equivocation on the word create there in that sense as well. That's probably being born out of his understanding of time. So there's just a number of different issues that right off of that philosophically I think I've got with even his comment here that we're probably not going to have time to get into, but I did want to at least point them out so you can kind of see. I don't even think we're using words in the same way when we're talking about these things between Boyd and at least myself and people who believe in the classical understanding. Now, the open theistic view then is the future is composed of these possibilities. And the reason why these possibilities exist is because there are free decisions that are going to exist based on responsible moral agents. And so the idea is that God's knowledge can't extend to the minutiae of the future reality because these free decisions do not constitute what can be known presently. They simply, and again, I believe the open theist understanding, they simply don't exist. Those future contingent answers or declarations don't exist. They're not part of knowable reality. Now, again, I would disagree with that as a philosophical statement, as a scriptural statement, I would disagree. And again, I do want to point out another piece of this. Each side is going to argue they're more biblical or they're more scriptural. That's not, at least in arguments where people are seriously considering scripture, and I would absolutely argue that open theists are seriously considering scripture. I would not make the argument that they're not. My argument would be, I don't agree with their interpretation, and there's various reasons why I don't. And we can talk about that too, and I know people have had questions about that. And I think those are questions I'd like to answer. I'm planning on doing a video on going through some of those interpretive differences. But I would argue there are real reasons why those interpretations are incorrect, or at least problematic, heavily problematic. So we'll continue on, though. So again, they would say they're not part of knowable reality. Now, what's the justification for openness? Well, again, open theologians are typically convinced that a literal reading of Scripture leaves them with no other alternative. Now, here's the issue, because I hold to a literal grammatical historical hermeneutic. But, and this is a very key important thing. And actually, let's see. Do I want to do the quote there first? Yeah, let's read this quote. So let's go ahead and read another quote from Boyd. The belief of mine which has caused such a stir is called the open view of God, though I prefer to call it the open view of the future. In a word, this view states that the future is not entirely settled. It partly consists of open possibilities. Since God knows reality perfectly, he knows the future perfectly, just as it is, partly settled and partly open. So some things about the future are a maybe, not a certainty, even to God. Why do I believe this? Because I simply can't make sense of the Bible without it. Okay, fair enough. Yes, the Bible clearly reveals that God is certain of many things that are going to take place ahead of time, but the Bible also reveals that some things about the future are open possibilities even to God. Okay, so again, we have an interesting statement there. Now, right off the bat, and I kind of want to hit on this piece of this, is there is generally a denial of exhaustive divine foreknowledge, or definite foreknowledge of God, because, again, the comment is the faithfulness to Scripture demands it. So that's the first comment. Here's the deal when you're dealing with hermeneutics. You need a literal grammatical historical hermeneutic, right? That's central to Scripture, okay? And the only time when, I'll say it like this, something maybe isn't literal word for word literal, or the interpretation doesn't quite factor in that way, it still has definite meaning, but the meaning or the intention of it has to be found by asking some very difficult questions about, for example, Scripture in totality. So here's what I mean. Say, for example, you have some of the verses that we've talked about where, oh, God relents, okay? Or, oh, God seems to change his mind about Hezekiah. It's another great one, right? Another great one. And we have to say, okay, how do we take that verse? Do we take that as God can simply change his mind? Well, we're going to be looking, not today, but in a future talk, we're going to be looking at some of these verses. One of the things you're going to see is that if you take that verse at face value, even if you hold to an openness view, it actually runs into very, 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 very serious catastrophic problems later on. Second, we have to ask ourselves, do we have a theology that the Bible has purported of anthropomorphism? The answer is yes. So that means when we look at an anthropomorphic verse, we have to ask ourselves, in what ways is God communicating, like what is he communicating through what he's saying? And what is a reality just because he's anthropomorphizing? So these are now become questions that we have to ask when God is speaking. We have to say, in what way is he condescending toward humanity? So to just simply treat it in the literal sense as though God were a man, that's where it becomes problematic. He's still God, and therefore that comes with a set of theology that we have to apply when we're looking at these verses to understand what they actually are trying to communicate. So again, that's my best attempt at just a brief understanding of how hermeneutically we're going to probably differ. And there's reasons for it, because literally if you take it and you say, well, I'm just going to interpret this as God as a human is speaking, all of a sudden you run into some serious catastrophic consequences, some of which we are actually going to talk about tonight. So just to kind of preempt that discussion, there it is. All right, next. So what are some of these? So there's one, the biblical reason. Some say, well, literal reading of Scripture requires this openness view. There's also philosophical reasons, though. And these are where people are persuaded that the traditional beliefs of omniscience and creaturely freedom and the traditional explanations of this don't work philosophically, okay? So the idea is this. If propositions that God believes about the future contingents have truth value, in other words, the comment is that if these propositions or these tenets about the future, about future free actions, if they convey truth, this is what must happen, then the argument philosophically that people are going to make is that that's fatalism. That the second you have that, that's fatalism. Now, again, I would argue compatibilistic theories have dealt with this very substantially, but okay, that's why people say this. They also then argue that a consequence of such fatalism is that humans and angels are essentially robots and cannot really engage in truly free actions. Okay? So the argument would be to avoid this is we say, well, future contingents are neither true nor false. They become true or false once they become part of the present. And so then they were going to argue that it's logically impossible to know such propositions because, for they are neither true or false. So they aren't necessarily, and here's the key, objects of knowledge. They are possible objects of knowledge, and there is your sort of redefinition. The redefinition is future events are no longer objects of knowledge. They are not things that are knowable. They are possible objects of knowledge. Again, I would disagree with that, but we can talk. So we also need to talk then about the solution to the problem of evil as it pertains to open theism. So the argument is that open theism actually absolves God of any culpability in evil. In other words, all these horrible things, the Holocaust, the genocides, the broken world, whatever you want to call it, all this stuff, disease and famine, all of this is not ultimately God's responsibility. Ultimately, it's not all on him. It's ultimately on the free decisions of humans and angels and things of that nature. Okay? And so they argue that the classical solutions then actually make God morally culpable for all of this stuff, which is really bad. And they even say that the fact that God does these things for good purposes or for providential purposes is also bad. Okay, in essence, that these could have a good thing. It's like, well, how could God do such an evil thing and then allow it to be used for good? It's like, that's God doing evil. That's means just by the ends kind of situation, which is not allowed. And so again, I would argue that's taking a very flattened view of how a compatibilist would actually look at this in terms of God's permission of evil, God's ordaining of evil, and what that means and how those things interact. So I would argue, take a look back at those things. I think there's more there to discuss. They also tend to argue that this essentially isolates God from being the ultimate cause of evil. And the arguments are going to be, again, that, well, God is a God of love, so that love must be freely chosen. Therefore, you need agents that can freely self-determine. Therefore, you need the possibility and reality of evil. And Boyd specifically is going to say this, which is kind of interesting, that God rules through a sovereignty of love rather than a sovereignty of control. Okay, so that's another piece of it, even though Boyd is going to deny that in a little bit, which is kind of fascinating. Also, people tend to typically argue that God is inherently risky because he can be and is often rejected. And this is, quote, the metaphysical price God must pay, end quote. So that's just a general summary of some of the openness theories and the openness justification, how openness theologians typically look at the problem of evil, again, at a very cursory level. So now let's get into moral character, compatibilistic freedom, and the infinitely intelligent Lord of history. So there's no question. On a surface level, this is satisfying. I mean, I won't deny that. I won't deny that on a surface glance, like, shoot, that might just resolve all of our problems, right? But it's when you get under the hood that there are actually some fairly serious consequences and some very serious issues that do end up popping up. And these are things that have to get addressed. And it's possible that maybe they have been addressed since this book was written. It's possible. People write things all the time. I'd love to read more. I'd love to read more new books. It's just kind of funny that when Boyd tried to address these, he addressed it by becoming more compatibilistic, which is fascinating. We're going to hit on that in a moment. It's actually really interesting. So let's take a look at the standard philosophical critiques of the open view of the future. So initially, critics would state that you don't actually need openness to resolve the tension between divine omniscience and creaturely freedom, because it is possible to conceive of a creaturely freedom in compatibilistic terms. Okay? So it's funny, and this is where I think we have to be very careful. Both openness theologians and compatibilists argue that choices are free. Both argue we have full control over our volition, and God does not manipulate volition. Funny enough, Boyd is actually going to say that God sort of can coerce volition. We'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, classically, traditionally, we both assume that. What we don't assume, or where we don't agree, is actually that our inclination is something we control. Compatibilists would say you can't control your inclination or desires. Open theologians would say you can. And that's essentially where the real tension actually is. It's at the level of inclination, not actually volition or choosing. Even though it's often put in a context of choosing, it really isn't about that at all. So people are convinced then that foreknown actions can be both determined and genuinely free in some real sense. Though, and this is also key, it's beyond a full explanation. The funny thing about this is there's two sort of problems that occur in Scripture. One of them is in Romans 9 through 11. The other one is going to be in Job. And they're actually somewhat related problems in a sense. Because in both these problems, they're the problem of evil and the problem of the choice of salvation. And it's interesting that in both of these arguments, people, or human beings, have this sort of frustration. And they express this frustration, say, well, this isn't fair, this doesn't sound right, or God, are you really just? God, what's going on? And God's answer is not an answer. And this is where I would argue I have, quote, a theology of mystery. Mystery essentially is that there are certain things God does not reveal because it does not bring him glory to reveal those things to people at this time. And those two things that God chooses to withhold when directly asked is the answer to the problem of evil and the answer to salvation. And he refuses to answer either of those. In the sense of Job, he basically says, Job, I'm not going to answer why these things happened. I'm simply going to say, you should trust me based on who I am. Paul similarly gives a similar answer. Jars of clay versus, jars for destruction, jars for, for salvation, essentially. And the comment there is, who are we to talk back to the potter? In other words, the thrust of the arguments there is, we're asking questions beyond our pay grade. There are certain things that are simply mysteries that we simply must accept. Those being two of them. Two of the big ones, actually. And I think there's real reason. Because the only way to actually have a good understanding of the reasons of God to do those things is if we actually have the mind of God. If we actually had his mind, his omniscience, his understanding, then we could see the whole picture. But without seeing the whole picture, and with also having sinful, fatally flawed humanity as part of who we are, I don't think we're going to even come to the right conclusion. Even if we had all the omniscience, I think we'd still come to the wrong conclusion, because we still have this latent, leftover effects of sin nature, for those who are saved anyway. You still have this latent sin nature that has to be gotten rid of through sanctification and the death of the flesh. Now, the argument here then is that there is a class of genuinely free acts that is being restricted artificially or wrongly to those acts that presume a power to do otherwise. So this essentially is the issue. Okay. Second, people are persuaded that the distinction between classes of future events that flows out of this restriction is incoherent. So again, this is where I would come in and say, look, I'm not really buying into the future events being possible objects of knowledge versus present events being objects of knowledge. Not really. I'm not sold on that idea. And so I'll go ahead and read a couple quotes. First quote, the distinction between a class of future events that can be known and a class of future events that cannot be known cannot be consistently maintained because it presumes on the one hand what it denies on the other. Quote, it presumes that God not only can, but must know something about future free creaturely activity, but at the same time it denies that he can in fact know anything about future free creaturely activity. And in doing so, it basically is a fatal flaw. Nash would say this. I actually love Nash. I've read a number of his books. I didn't realize he talked in Open Theism, but I've read a number of his books. I really, really like Nash. Ronald Nash. Phenomenal author if you ever get a chance to read. He's written some short books, but man, they're good. Quote, how can God know what he's going to do in the future when God's own future acts are a response to future free actions that he cannot know? Right? You have this sort of interesting thing where truly, how does God plan for the future when future free acts exist? And there's a lot of answers to that, and we're going to get into some of those. But I'll say it like this. To simply say, well, he can because he knows enough or he knows certain things, it still doesn't really pass the sniff test when you have people in history saying, shoot, if not for one general switch, and this is the point he's going to make later in the chapter, if not for switching out one general in essentially leading up to World War II, you wouldn't have had World War II. I mean, it's kind of unreal how like small insignificant decisions can catastrophically change the future. I mean, it really is bizarre. So, to try and argue that God knows exactly the right events and exactly the right things about the future, and to me, that's a harder sell. That's a much harder sell. So God can know what he will do and retain a significant providential control because the Open Theist answers, he knows at least some future contingents, or he knows what he'll do irrespective of those decisions of responsible moral agents. But again, this is a problem. Either God can know future events or will control regardless of relationship. Like, this is sort of where we're going here with this. Now, the problem is that these philosophical critiques, in some sense, don't apply to Boyd anymore. And so this is where this chapter really starts to get cooking, is the comment is like, actually, Boyd's changed the game with Open Theism, and we've now got to address this. So the issue in Boyd's book, Satan and the Problem of Evil, which I think is 2021, I think. So it's a good, 24 years old now. I mean, it's been a while. Again, I haven't read all of Boyd's stuff, obviously. I've read some things. But this is really interesting here. Constructing a Trinitarian warfare theodicy is essentially one of the goals of the book. And the argument there is this, quote, the distinction between two classes of future events, well, or I said the argument, hold on one second, I want to make sure I read this right. Okay, so here it is. So I'll go ahead and give you this quote first. Quote, the distinction between two classes of future events cannot be sustained if the self-determining freedom of the contingent beings is regarded as an unlimited end in itself. So, here's the issue. Openness theologians essentially now, at least from this book on, are allowing for some form of compatibilism. This is what I was unaware of. Now, I don't know this is all open theologians. I don't know this everybody. It's Boyd, certainly. But here, this is really interesting because Boyd essentially came to the realization openness theology does not work wholesale. I mean, there it is. That's Boyd. Not even me. Not even a critic. That's just Boyd. Boyd was basically like, yeah, open theism doesn't work as an all-encompassing theory. I found that interesting. So what does he do? He allows for some form of compatibilism now in his theory. The problem with this is the second he does this, and he's going to try to justify this in a number of different ways, but the second he does this, it's a problem. It's a big problem. So Boyd states this, quote, so God can retain, quote, significant providential control, unquote, over the flow of history simply because he can have, quote, a significant role in steering human choices. So now, first of all, note his use of the word control. I thought God was sovereign in love, not sovereign in control, but now we're having to say he's sovereign in control. And not only that, but he's steering human choices. But I thought human choices were supposed to be free and without this sort of pigeonholing. And I mean, guys, we gotta pause on that for a second. That is a significant shift in openness thinking that Boyd just stated there. So Boyd moves beyond whether or not God can in fact foreknow future actions of moral responsible agents, quote, to the question of, well, what kind of things can he foreknow? And here's where this starts to get really crazy. And this starts to have, literally, as I was reading this, I was like, dude, the implications for this on like every piece of theology are devastating. So let's jump in. So how can God then retain significant providential control if it's logically impossible for him to know libertarianly free decisions of responsible moral agents? How is it God just not guessing? And Boyd's solution to this is fascinating. He now creates a distinction. And I'm sure he's probably got verses he's going to use to justify it, but I'm going to say that this is not at core a biblically driven distinction. This seems like a distinction out of philosophical necessity, okay, in order to maintain what he wants to say. But again, I'm sure he has verses. I'll say it like this. The verses that he could use, and I could think of a couple, are so few and far between that trying to establish a major doctrine as this would be, because this is a major doctrinal switch. And you'll see why when I get into this. This doctrinal switch that's about to happen here in Boyd, this is crazy. It is a crazy doctrinal switch. Before I get into that, let me just take a look here. I thought God knowing the future is part of the definition of what it means to be God. When the definition of God means God is in the future, I don't get it. Okay, I'll try and explain it one more time here. The issue is that if you redefine knowledge as only things that have happened in history or are happening at present, and you redefine knowledge in such a way that you cannot have knowledge about the future, then open theists would argue that God has perfect and total and complete knowledge because he knows all things past and present. They argue that knowledge of the future is not a real knowledge. It's not a thing that can be known. This does, I would argue, run into an issue where God is ever increasing in knowledge. In other words, omniscience is constantly growing. And I think there's a big problem with that, but that's a whole nother topic. So there's my answer. Very good question, though. All right. So what is this massive? Do open theists redefine knowledge and God? They have to redefine, and again, open theists are probably not going to argue that. They're probably not going to argue that in fact, they're going to say, well, we're not redefining God. But here's the ultimate deal. The second you start making these types of changes, you are changing theology. So redefining God, yeah, there's no way of getting around that. People will say, well, no, we're not doing it. But from my perspective, I would say, yes, you are. That is what's happening. Okay, whether it's good or wrong, leaving that aside for the moment, it is happening. So yeah, that is true. That they're going to have some changes in categories for sure. It might not be like a definite, well, it is a definitional change, but it's also changes in categories. But here is this thing that Boyd does that just blows my mind because of the substantial theological implications. I would argue this is an entirely novel thing. Again, there's a couple verses we can point to, but I would by no means ever try to develop a doctrine of this. And here's what it is. He basically says that God balances his oversight through activity that is associated with established characters versus yet to be established characters. Now I'm going to get into this more so we can get into this, but you'll see where this is going. So he argues that essentially when you have an action from an established character, that could be foreknown, and he's even going to argue determined. That essentially, if a person's character is so set that it is irrevocably set, okay, he's going to argue for an irrevocable setness of character, that then the action of that character can be foreknown and even determined. Okay? And this, the actions of these characters, allows God to have significant providential control. Then he says that there's characters that have yet to be established, character in certain people, and that can't be foreknown or determined because the person who's got that, they still have self-determining or libertarian freedom, and thus they have the power to do otherwise. Now, if you're following that, what he just said is every human being has, whether it's points or a single point or whatever it is, points or point where they become irrevocably set in their ways while on earth prior to death. And in that situation, they have now given up or lost libertarian free will. So Boyd no longer holds that human beings must have libertarian free will at all times. He's going to argue that they start with it, but will lose it. And I'm going to argue that is such a fundamental shift in open theism that if he still holds that, I don't know, I'd have to go and check. I'm just kind of going off the book. But if he still holds that, I don't know that he's actually open theist anymore. He's something new. And not only that, I want you to think for a moment about the implications of that for salvation. He's essentially affirming that no, you are not actually potentially savable up until death. He's actually arguing that at some point in your history, you're probably going to become unsavable. And that's kind of wild. That's actually wild. And I think this results from this whole issue of not allowing for truly compatibilistic will and having a misunderstanding there. Because, again, in the Calvinistic compatibilistic sense, you could be saved up until you die. Will you or not? Well, that's determined by whether or not God regenerates you. But you have the capacity to be, theoretically, in the sense that it could happen. But Boyd's actually arguing that, no, there's a point at which God can't even save you while you're still here on earth. I mean, I don't know if that's getting through exactly, but this is a radical shift in theology here. Because we're also now arguing that all humanity is not in the same boat. That you've got some humanity which has the possibility of accepting God, and you have some humanity that's currently walking this earth that simply doesn't. I would be curious to go back historically and see what the pushback he got on this was, because that's some pretty hefty stuff. But then you have issues with the open theistic argument, So here's the thing. Again, he even argues that the extent and duration of the domain of freedom varies, and it's unknowable to the contingent observer. But what about the idea that God gives moral agents a domain of irrevocable freedom that binds himself to interact with them in ways that honor that gift of self-determination? Well, this is coming into discord with one of Open Theism's main points, is that no, God has covenanted with humanity to act in accordance with libertarian free will and self-determination. And now Boyd is saying, well, humanity can basically throw that away in some sense, or accidentally lose it, even worse, and then God can do whatever he wants. And Boyd's actually going to literally argue that that's exactly what happens. So this is some wild stuff. Again, this book is interesting. So what remains then, quote, constant, is, quote, God's commitment not to micro-control a free agent he has created, but when that agent oversteps the parameters of freedom, then, and solidifies his character, well, then God can do whatever he wants. Then he can go beyond the domain of freedom, and he can essentially coerce or determine their actions. And here's the funny thing, that he's going to argue that that's exactly what happened when Peter denied Jesus 3 times. We're going to some really wild territory here. So the understanding then from Boyd is that once an agent, a human being, has given up that self-determining freedom, God no longer has any obligation to refrain from intervening on the freedom of that agent, because his character is irrevocably open or closed to God's love, and that's salvation level. And it's no longer possible for that agent to be anything other than he is. I think that flies in the face of one of Christianity's central tenets, which is that people are sinful until God meets them. And this is actually arguing that no, God can't do. There's a point where God simply can't do it. Now, you could say, what about the unforgivable sin? You could say, what about hardening of Pharaoh's heart? Those are some of the instances that I was sort of talking about earlier. But those are not standard situations. Those are very isolated situations. So to try to apply this to like anyone, I think is a big problem. So let's go ahead and read some more quotes here. Because this really, this is some stuff here. So Boyd's comment. Moral responsibility applies to the acquired character of self-determining agents even more fundamentally than it applies to particular decisions agents make, which reflect and reinforce that character. Traditionally, theologians have distinguished the character a person receives from God from the character they freely acquire. There is no contradiction in the claim that a person morally responsible for an act, even though they could not have done otherwise, so long as that character has now rendered their action certain, flowed from a character they themselves acquired. It was not infused into them by God. Hence, if God decides that it fits his providential plan to use a person whose choices have solidified his character as wicked, God is not responsible for this person's wickedness. Oh my goodness, that's compatibilism. Now, you might say, well, what's the difference between true compatibilism? Here's the difference. Boyd is going to argue that every person must acquire that moral character within their lifetime. Calvinism says, no, we acquired that moral character at Adam's sin. So that's the difference. So now, with Boyd, we're not even talking really about open theism anymore. We're just talking about what is original sin and what does it cover. Because what Boyd just said here is exactly what a compatibilist would say. He literally says, contingent actions based on a fallen character do not make God responsible for that wickedness if God decides to fit into his providential plan. That's what compatibilists have been saying since day one. He's just going to argue that no, the issue is that we don't have, I would argue this probably would have to say, that the original sin doesn't lead to the types of things that we would see, and that you're still free in some sense. Or maybe that common grace covered over. I'd have to go and check and see what he believes. But in essence, that's where he differs from compatibilism, is we would argue that no, this indwelling nature of sin is bad. And it essentially makes this true, right here, what he's saying. So, but this is compatibilism. Literally, he changes his view on original sin, and he's a compatibilist from this statement. So, and he's totally out of open theism at that point. So this is why I was so shocked when I was reading this. I'm like, wow, some of this stuff is sounding massively compatibilistic. Okay, so let me go ahead and read another quote here. This quote is from Boyd, again, from Satan and the Problem of Evil. This is a really important one. Really, really important one. sorry, I'm not fully better yet, so I apologize, guys. He argues that the Messiah's betrayal was predestined, and Jesus foreknew that Judas would betray him. These contentions do not contradict the view that morally responsible, self-determining actions cannot be predestined or foreknown, as long as Judas was not in particular chosen to carry out the deed before Judas had made himself into the kind of person who would carry out the deed. After Judas unfortunately hardened himself into this kind of person, note the use of that hardened language, I think that's probably scripturally how I was going to defend this, wove his character into a providential plan, God thus used evil for a higher good. Jesus could therefore foreknow that Judas would be the one to betray him, but nothing suggests this was God's plan from eternity that Judas would play this role. As such, there is no difficulty in understanding how God could predestine and thus foreknow that Jesus would be betrayed and crucified by wicked people without predestining or foreknowing who specifically would betray and crucify him. God orchestrated events to the extent that certain wicked people acted out their self-acquired characters and did what they wanted to do in conformity with his plan to have his son betrayed and crucified. But they are still responsible for what they did, for they are responsible for the kinds of agents they have freely become. God was simply employing their simple intentions to his own end. Now, there are a lot of things that I would say about this. And one of the things that comes to my mind immediately is this. We have now an actual serious problem in that if this is true, whether someone is saved or not is based not even on their own decisions, but it's based on like the circumstances of their lives. Here's what I mean. Or it's based on arbitrariness, complete arbitrariness, right? There's three possible views of why people do things. One, they desire it. Two, it's a spontaneous act of will. Or three, their situation compels them to do so, or at least makes them think in their head this is the best course of action or something like that. The problem is what Boyd is saying here is that if you have a solidified character, most likely because you've acquired it, how would you acquire it? Through decisions you've made. How do you make those decisions? Through situations that happen to you, through desires, whatever. You start tracing that back, guys, what happens? Your rejection of God is based on decisions you made in the past. Decisions you had no idea would even affect that. Not only that, decisions based on, most likely, I would guess, not arbitrary, spontaneous things of free will or salvation's arbitrary. My guess is he would say desires, but the problem is desires, again, well, where are those desires coming from? You're going to argue that people aren't fundamentally flawed if they can actually make these decisions. So probably not desires, so decisions, but decisions are based on life situations. Boyd has literally put salvation at the whim of a person's situation in life. That's a consequence of this. So that's intriguing. That is intriguing. Yeah, this is the problem. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. But let's go ahead and continue moving on, because this is another really long talk, as these are going to be. These are going to be some really long talks, these last couple here, not Open Theism. So finally, divine coercion, the key to continuing history. So in other words, this open-closed view of Open Theism, which I would question whether it's really even Open Theism at this point or something completely different, excuse me, now requires compatibilism, because there are going to be now free acts that are coerced and determined. Okay, now they're going to argue God is an infinitely intelligent chess player because he anticipates every move and every possibility, and he's going to act only unilaterally or coercively when necessary. But, quote, he will ensure that his purposes for the created order are accomplished in part by acting in ways that override or withdraw genuine freedom of choice that imply empty, future, creaturely actions of their uncertain or contingent nature. In other words, Boyd is now arguing that God can override free will when he deems that it's okay to do so, and he can override genuine freedom of choice when he deems that it is okay to do so through coercion or direct control. That's mind-boggling. Again, I'm boggled here. Color me boggled. I'm just shocked that he would go this way. That this was unexpected. So let's now talk about the incoherence of this view. So first we have this revocable nature of an irrevocable gift. So the problem is that Boyd essentially says that unilateral or coercive activity of God can happen in the lives of particular moral agents. And this is a big difficulty because The foundational convictions of Boyd is that the God has a covenant to not do that, right? The ultimate purpose of God includes having free agents whose self-determining freedom is irrevocable. Irrevocable. But now it's not irrevocable. Now it's losable and revocable. So he's going to argue that God is now allowed to act compatibilistically and must do so in a form of soft or even hard coercion. And God's going to essentially compel people to do what they otherwise might not do. Because he argues they no longer have free self-determining freedom. This is a problem. Peter's denial is the thing that's going to undermine, he talks about it extensively, but it's the thing that's going to undermine his entire belief system here. Because he's going to argue that moral character and moral activity are so linked that when self-determined individuals are put in the correct fashion or situation, their behavior is not just predictable, but it's certain. It's no longer contingent. And so God essentially would know then that Peter's character was solidified. And so he brings about this highly pressurizing circumstance whereby he essentially forces Peter into denying Jesus 3 times. Wow. Now, somebody brought up last time, but what about Abraham when God says in Genesis, now I know, what did it say here, right? Let me go ahead and find this. This is actually kind of a good one. Yeah, Genesis 2:22-12. Do not lay a hand on the boy. He said, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me, your son, your only son. Here's my comment though, man. Like, how in the world do you get a situation in which God, up until the very moment, does not know what Abraham is going to do? Think about it this way, so much so that say Abraham chose otherwise, where is God at that point? You're talking about maybe starting over with a different person? So how does he not know Abraham's character, even though he knows Abraham's whole life and everything, and yet he knows Peter's character so thoroughly that he's like, oh, I've got this whole thing set up, and Peter's definitively going to deny him. But then you run into a weird thing, because that that irrevocable character of Peter that led him to cowardice is then changed, because then Peter no longer becomes a coward in the future. So, he accepts Jesus, right? So it's like there's some really big inconsistencies the second you start applying this view. And that's just one of them. And so I would argue again that this issue of Peter is a big problem because, well, Peter did actually change his character. That irrevocable, irreversible character was changed because he no longer is denying Jesus. In fact, he goes and dies. So how do we go from an irrevocable character, where he's going to deny and then change it? This doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. So we've got some pretty serious issues with Boyd's theory here. Second, there's this issue of God being the occasional author of sin. Again, the whole point of open theism is that God's not the author of sin. So first point, open theism, people have libertarian free will. Boyd backs down on that and says, no, they don't. At least they don't always. Then the comment is, well, God doesn't cause sin. He's not the primary cause of sin. Boyd's going to back down on that too and say, well, no, he's the occasional author of sin. In all ways, this is a recognition of Boyd not being able to actually deal with the realities of open theism and saying, I'm going to have my cake and eat it too. I'm going to assume open theism where it's convenient, and I'm going to assume compatibilism where it's convenient, and I'm just going to say that both of them work together and try and come up with some reason to explain that. But that, again, is a problem. So here we have open theism. Boyd now is allowing open theism to allow for God to work in a coercive fashion. And the problem here is this makes it really difficult to explain or maintain that God is not the ultimate cause of evil. And it's also hard to explain any particular evil because, and here's the issue, the second you say that God can indeed coerce an evil act, which he did in Peter's case, according to Boyd. And that's a minor thing in some sense. How do you get the existence of the Holocaust at that point? Could not God have coerced some things in some different ways so that didn't happen? I mean, this is the now philosophical conundrum that open theists would have, opening themselves up to allowing some form of compatibilism. In other words, they now get, when an open theist opens themselves to compatibilism, they now get none of the benefits of open theism and all of the critiques of compatibilism all wrapped into one, right? Because the second you allow for that, well, now you get all those critiques. So here they are, the same critiques they levy against compatibilism, we now would levy against open theism, at least according to Boyd's construal of it, and say, you can't have your cake and eat it too, because you don't actually have the technical definitions and language to defend against those attacks, to defend against those critiques. You don't have the language to do it because your view of compatibilism does not incorporate the correct things necessary to sustain it. So, boy, this is some, again, super fascinating stuff here. So here we go. God ordains evil for greater good. Quote, this is another one, boy. God intentionally orchestrated the evil intentions of his brothers to get Joseph into Egypt. Let's read some more from Boyd, 296. Let's go ahead and take a crack at this, because again, this is some stuff. Okay, Boyd argues, we must accept the consequence that this passage referring to Joseph being sold by his brothers always minimizes the responsibility of human agents. That's fascinating. He's willing to come out and say it. I mean, honestly, I'm going to throw it out there and say this. To Boyd's credit, he is not trying to hide anymore with these statements. And I appreciate this. Because this is intellectual honesty. So here we go. I do get on intellectual honesty. And I think that there's a problem when some people kind of come and start to kind of just say, well, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And I sit there and I say to myself, there's so much more to this argument, and we don't agree on some fundamental definitions, and this is going to take a while to even argue. But beyond that, I do get frustrated when people aren't intellectually honest. And that does happen. Sometimes they're unaware of it, sometimes they are. This shows, I would argue, Boyd's being intellectually honest. And I appreciate that. I actually would commend him wholeheartedly. This is showing he's being intellectually honest. In fact, his capitulation to compatibilism, I would argue, shows him being intellectually honest. He sat there, looked at the data, and said, you know what? In reality, I cannot reconcile these two things. And he came to that conclusion. Now, yeah. And so he's doing the same thing here. He's saying, no, it minimizes the concept of responsibility of human agents. This conclusion, this is back to quoting Boyd, this conclusion Joseph himself draws from his observation that God used his brothers to send him to Egypt. Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, he tells them, for God sent me. If this text is taken as evidence of how God always controls human action, if God is involved in each kidnapping and murder in the way he is involved in the activity of Joseph's brothers, we must be willing to console every murderer and kidnapper with Joseph's words. Do not be distressed or angry with yourself, for God kidnapped and murdered your victims. We cannot universalize the mode of God's operation in his pastors without also universalizing its implication for human responsibility. True enough. But the fact that he's actually arguing, though, and admits that God seems to be in charge of this evil, that's a big deal, because that's typically not something open theism wants to allow to behold in terms of the central premise. So, the problem with Peter then, either God knew a future contingent, or he coerced Peter into sinning by setting him up to fall, effectively removing his self-determining freedom. Now they have to affirm that some acts of hard coercion are intransitive, where causing or determining an event does not entail responsibility for the event. That's what compatibilists have been saying since day one. So, here we go, guys. I mean, this is the stuff. This is the stuff. It's, I mean, you know, interesting stuff here. And again, this is just Boyd. Like, I'm really just shocked about like Boyd's own things, his own comments on this. Sorry, I'm gonna take a look at the chat real quick because it was a good point to just pause and just read up on what some people were saying. God chose Moses and changed our Aaron. She's an offers to kill him. Use Moses. Choose Eli before then he kills. Changes it. Yeah, but and I'll just point to the person who's kind of making some comments. I don't want to call out a name. I guess I could. I don't know how that plays out on the internet though when you like mention someone's name. But you're raising these questions. I'm guessing you've probably been here the whole time. My comment is not even dealing with those issues. My comment is look at what Boyd is saying. That's my question. Look at what Boyd is saying. He's the one saying it. I've pretty much only read Boyd quotes this entire night. Look at what he's saying. He is allowing for some things traditionally not allowed for in open theism. That's the comment. Now, we can get into some of these other ones. I'm actually going to do, by the way, you might want to stay tuned for future talks, because I'm actually going to do deep dives into all of these verses. I've already done some of them in previous talks, but I'm going to do deep dives in all of them. I think you're probably very interested, and we could have some really fun conversation. Tonight, though, I'm just hitting on a very specific issue of I'm shocked by what Boyd has done in Open Theism, because he's essentially allowed for compatibilism in it. And I don't know, maybe I don't know what Boyd's position is. Maybe people have kind of walked away from Boyd. Maybe Boyd changed back. I just don't know. I'd just be curious. I'm just kind of looking at some of his writing and saying, wow, that's some interesting transitions from Boyd. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your comments. Because again, I love comments. I love reading them. Yeah, we'll talk more soon, I'm sure. But there we go. But yeah, Boyd's comments here, though. I mean, in fact, if you could, I'd love for you, if you don't mind, make a comment on Boyd's comments. Like, the fact that Boyd allows compatibilism, does that put Boyd outside of open theism for you? I'd be very curious to hear your thought on that. Feel free, jump in, let me know. I'm just curious. Like, from the comments I've been reading tonight, to me, that makes Boyd really not even open theism anymore. It really makes him something different, some hybrid view. Not true open theism, but again, I'm just one person. I'd be curious to see what you think about that. Please feel free. You know, when Boyd essentially says right in here that God does indeed cause evil, and that God does indeed take away human free will, and that God does indeed coerce people into sinning, what's your thought on that? You know, I'm very curious. Okay, continuing on, we're going to talk now about, yeah, this issue that Boyd is now willing to sanction coercion is really problematic, because now it becomes virtually impossible to rescue God from the problem of evil. So the claim of open theism is that that their view of evil is superior to classical views. No, open theism is just the rejection of classical views, simplicity. Okay, and I'm gonna chat with you for just a second, because I just want to clear up a couple things. Are open theists partial compatibilists? And just a quick yes or no, just so I understand, because again, you know, I love doing these talks. I love analyzing texts and things like that. I'm not necessarily a master of all things open theism. So just, are open theists now claiming to be compatibilists? Okay, I'll wait and see. I'll see if something pops in, but I gotta, you know. So open theism in general has now argued that libertarian free will is not not mandatory. See, this is what's fascinating to me. I'm curious to know how much of a shift. That's a big shift. So God can stress. So LFW doesn't have to exist. So open theism isn't even holding to libertarian free will anymore? Well, I mean, yeah, I know. The argument that God's going to be open is not contingent on the existence of humanity. True. I'm just simply stating, do open theists now deny? Yeah, see, this is the crazy stuff. Do open theists essentially now deny that libertarian free will is key to open theism in terms of God's relationship to humanity? Because my understanding was that was one of the central tenets, was that one of the central tenets of open theism was that humans have libertarian free will. Well, true. Libertarian and God predestined a man. Let me throw you this real quick. Do open theists still maintain that libertarian free will is something that humanity holds throughout a person's life, or can it be lost? And again, I'm just, for people who are listening, what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to ask somebody who I think is more connected to the open theism world in terms of what people are saying right now, which, you know, I'm just not in those circles, so I'm kind of doing a little bit of information collecting here. Yeah, so do open theists hold that mankind has libertarian free will throughout his entire life, or no? That'd be the question. Then I'm going to have to hop back on because we're already at an hour. But this has been fun. I'm super thankful. Okay. OT can believe it. Really? Oh, man, this is fascinating. OT can believe in either. God is free to choose. Mankind is irrelevant. Okay, hold on one second. God is free to choose. Mankind is irrelevant to if open theism is true. Could you rephrase that? And this could just be me, that just the syntax of that I'm not quite getting. Go ahead and do me a favor, rephrase that real quick. And then I'm going to have to take a pause and move on. But I appreciate you interacting with me right now, because this is very, very helpful. Again, shocking information to me, because in that view, then open theism is so different. I think though, okay, here we go. Boy, was a Calvinist open theism one time. God has. Man was right. Yeah, true. But I'm just saying, in general, open theists now. Do open theists now, forget about Boyd, do open theists now argue that mankind has libertarian free will? I think you said open theists can believe in either. That's odd, though. That's interesting. All right, thank you for trying to rephrase it. This is wild. This is wild to me. Interesting stuff. All right, well, we're going to continue. Most OT will say, okay. So yeah. So most OT will say man has thought. Yeah, because again, you're going to find people, I'm sure, that can articulate theories in different ways, and that's just going to be true. But most will say man is the libertarian free will. And let me ask you this. Do most believe that mankind can lose that libertarian free will? My guess is no. Because that's essentially what Boyd is saying. Boyd is saying you can lose libertarian free will. I am going to argue, though, that maintaining libertarian free will and also the idea that God can override people does cause a problem. I think they would say God can override, like, can turn into a beast. Interesting, but I'll throw it like this. The type of overriding that I'm talking about, and I think that Boyd's talking about, is not a specific incident, like a one-off. This is like, in general, this is something God can and does do to most humans at some point. Like, this is a much more general thing. All right. Well, thank you so much, by the way, for your willingness to have a little conversation with me. I really appreciate that. It was fun. And thank you for being able to help me understand the open theist, what open theists are generally believing right now, because again, this stuff from Boyd is just shocking. So what I want to kind of hit on then is this issue. So certain evils occur then because God simply cannot with integrity prevent them without revoking the irrevocable gift of freedom that is necessary to love. This would be the open theist comment. Is that why does evil exist? Well, because God simply can't prevent all evil. It's not possible, because that's inconsistent with the irrevocable gift of freedom. And again, that's why I'm kind of curious about really people who deny libertarian free will, why you'd be open theist. And then I do get the understanding that, open theism means that God is open. I do get that. And denying classical attributes, that's where I differ substantially with open theism. I definitely affirm classical attributes for a number of reasons. But, again, people can believe what they want to believe. But we'll continue on. So at this point, though, we have this issue where, because God actually can interact in human history and guide decisions and force evil things to happen, all this kind of stuff, people now have to simply trust that he's always just going to do everything that he can to maximize good and minimize evil, given the situation he has. However, quote, and I'm going to go ahead and read this in full quote here. Since God can and does work unilaterally from time to time to bring about a certain state of affairs, and since this coercive involvement can entail, as it did in the case of Peter, real violations to the gift of self-determining freedom given to moral agents, we simply cannot say God is always doing all he could do to prevent evil and promote good, when what he is doing falls short of a violation of the covenant he has established with free agents. So that's a big problem if you're going to hold to some form of compatibilism with your open theism. Now, final thing, we'll go ahead and read one more quote, there's even more, but I'm going to have to cut this short because we're already an hour. Some of these are going to be long because there's just a lot to talk about. But let's hit this other quote on page 300, another quote from Boyd. All right, where's my final quote from Boyd? This is from one of his earlier works, Letters from a Skeptic. Quote. That's just his sort of comment about... Yeah, that's just his statement of why open theism is necessary. We've kind of already covered that. I don't think I need to actually go back and rehash that. All right. Let's see. Do I want to say anything else here? So here's sort of the issue. If the God of the possible is prepared for and capable of responding to every contingent issue, and also that God reserves the right to coerce wills of contingent beings given particular situations, how then do we rescue God from the prevention of evil, where he actually has the power and sufficient precedent to use his unilateral activity to stop that evil? the comment is, it seems like God could probably be doing a lot more to prevent the worst evil. And so therein is the sort of quick philosophical understanding of like why this is a problem. All right, I think that's actually where I want to kind of end it tonight. I think that's pretty good. My comment, I guess, in closing would simply be that we have to resist any attempt to resolve the problem of evil in a manner that either compromises. This is a quote from D.A. Carson. We must resist any attempt to resolve the problem of evil in a manner that either compromises God's nature or undermines his sovereign purpose to work all things, including evil, for the good of his children and the glory of his name. And so that's kind of where I want to end it. Man, it was an hour and 5 minutes. It was a long one. There are probably going to be a couple long ones because there's a lot of stuff in here. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you so much for chatting, everybody. Thank you so much for the conversation. Super appreciate it. I will now open a Zoom call. Anyone is welcome to attend. The only thing I ask is this is technically a church meeting. So this is part of our church. This is technically a church meeting. And as such, I would simply ask to be respectful in these times because I'm literally going to I give people direct access to myself and members of our church. So I would simply request to be polite. We have fun conversations, people from all over, people of all different beliefs. It is a church meeting, but it is also understood that people who are not part of our church are going to come in and have conversations, and that's the point. But there's just essentially a level of respect that I like to maintain in these meetings. So there's the link. Stay in the waiting room until I open because I do have to shut down this live stream and turn off all the cameras before I can upload the Zoom. So feel free and join in there. We're going to hang out, have some good conversations, talk more. I'd love to see everybody there, whoever wants to join. Looking forward to tonight. It's probably going to be fun. And with that, and my Zoom is not even open. So sorry, give me 1 second. Let me actually open that meeting. All right, and we're canceling those. Okay, so the meeting is now open, so people can now join. So sorry if you tried to join and it's not working. Go ahead, exit out, rejoin now. So rejoin now if you want to join. It's now open. It is the church meetings link for those of you who are wondering, and there is the link right there as well. All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church for this critique of open theism and what is at stake, the trustworthiness of God by Kjoss Helseth. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.